All right, in chapter 4, we are talking about deriving meaning. And as your book and the videos get at, there are lots of ways that you can derive meaning from art. In fact, we've already talked about a couple of them, and that is there's meaning in materials, like the Marcus Aurelius statue. There's meaning in composition, so the elements and principles that we talked about, that you can create meaning through those things. There's many ways, of course. There's symbolism, there's metaphor, there's literal kind of illustration of an idea. I'm going to touch on a few in this video, and the first one we're looking at is called Nighthawks by Edward Hopper. And the meaning in this primarily comes from the fact that he painted it shortly after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. So the date on this in your book is 1942. So in fact, he could have started it in December of 1941, immediately after the Pearl Harbor event. It's very unlike a lot of Hopper's work. Hopper's work is often much sunnier. It's very quiet, like this painting is, but it's seldom this dark. So, it really was kind of a reflection of his feeling of, kind of where the country was headed. So a good example of how context can really add meaning to a painting. Another good example of a historical event that affected the meaning of a work of art is this sculpture. It's called Bent Propeller. It's by Alexander Calder. Calder's work was often very playful. He often used bright colors, primary colors. That's red, yellow, blue, as you know. And so gave his work a childlike feeling often. The tragic aspect of this work, however, is that this picture, as you see it here, the bent propeller was sitting in front of the World Trade Center. And so on September 11th, 2001, it was destroyed. And so, of course, the irony of a sculpture named Bent Propeller being at that site and destroyed in that way is a meaning that, of course, the artist could never have anticipated when he made it. A couple other ways that you can think about meaning. In your book, of course, there are a number of ways that historians, writers have come up with critiquing artwork, of writing about it. And I'm not going to go into all of those, but one thing I do want to touch on is this idea of modernism and postmodernism. The video that's on the syllabus is a timeline of artistic movements in the late 19th and early 20th century. This is the modern era, and really it's what defines the modern era, is these various movements that took place. Artists got together, talked about what they thought was important in art, often wrote manifestos sort of declaring what they thought was important for art in the modern era, and then would make art in that style. And so here's a timeline of some, not all, but some of the artistic movements of the modern era. In the middle of the 1970s, historians feel, was kind of the end of the modern era and the beginning of the postmodern era. And postmodernism really can be defined in a simple way as being different from modernism because artists decided that they no longer wanted to simply have influences from other fine artists, that they wanted to open up possibilities of influence from different areas. So postmodern art tends to take a lot of its influence from things like popular culture. We've seen a very good example of that in Laurie Simmons, The Music of Regret. It's contemporary art, especially because it's time-based, but she's making reference to things like soap operas, to children's television. So it's very different from the kind of influences that a modern artist would have. The next thing I want to mention in this section is the idea that meaning can even be invested in architecture. That may sound like kind of a funny thing, but in fact, medieval cathedrals were full of meaning. There were multiple ways that you could derive meaning from a building. If you look at the videos, you saw that the two different spires on the Chartres Cathedral were designed with moon cycles and sun cycles, so the height of those spires was dependent on the number of feet that was in it. The moon cycle, the moon spire was 28 feet shorter than the sun spire. The sun spire was 365 feet tall, so 365 days in a year, 28 being the number of days in a month or a lunar cycle. When you look at the labyrinth, and this is, if you remember from the other video, this is on the floor of the cathedral. Labyrinths were put into cathedrals as a place that people could pray. You notice in this that these people are simply strolling through the labyrinth, but in medieval times, a person who went there to utilize the labyrinth would have moved through it in a very different way. They would have taken a step, said a prayer perhaps with rosary beads, then taken another step, say a prayer with rosary beads, and so on. So it could take several hours to move through prayer labyrinth. And in fact, people who are very devout might do that activity on their knees. So that could perhaps double or triple the amount of time that they spent in that labyrinth. It could be all day long. If we go back to that image of the labyrinth, you'll notice a few things about it. One, you have these kind of look like teeth on a gear or spokes. If you took the time to count all those, you'd see that there are 365 of them. Again, another reference to the solar year. As the priest in the video points out, there are 270 stones used to make this labyrinth. That's 9 times 30, 9 months, the time it takes to gestate a baby, and 30 days in a month, so 270 stones. And of course, the priest talks about the idea that this journey that a devout person takes is an analogy for gestation. The time that a baby is in a mother's womb, but then the time that an adult is here on earth is like a gestation before they're born again into heaven. So cathedrals were really full of meaning, often mathematical meanings, that any devout person at that time would understand. The last thing I want to mention is the idea that there can actually be meaning in work that's completely abstract. One of those artistic movements of the modern era was abstract expressionism, and Jackson Pollock was perhaps the king of abstract expressionism. And one thing I really want to point out here, I think for people who don't know a lot about art, it's really easy for them to judge things negatively. To look at a splatter painting by Jackson Pollock and say, oh, a kid could do that, my kid could do that. Well, the answer is yes, they could, but they would have no sense of the meaning of what they were doing. Jackson Pollock saw numerous meanings in what he was doing, and in fact, it took him 30 years to arrive at this technique after going through many other techniques. So, this is really his mature work. And I really love this video because he makes a number of really provocative statements in a very short time. He says things like that he doesn't work from sketches, so that's important. He doesn't plan ahead. He paints on the floor so he can be in the painting. He can walk all around it. If a canvas is hanging on the wall, then there's really only one way you can approach it. And he relates it to Navajo sand painting, which actually we're going to look at in the next section. He says he wants to express his feelings rather than illustrate them. So rather than painting a picture of blue man playing a guitar looking depressed, he wants to express his feelings in abstract form. And another thing he says is technique is a means of arriving at a statement. So he's saying that, yes, many artists are very talented and have honed their technique, but Jackson Pollock felt that it was almost kind of a punchline, that there really wasn't open to interpretation. And finally he says, I have a notion of what I am about when I am painting. So abstract painting like this can really be a reflection of the man, Jackson Pollock, in that moment, in that year.